was killed in a brutally violent fashion. If they would go after a federal judge like that, nobody was off limits.
It's one thing to see crime scene tape. It's another to see where a man's physical being has been blown away.
This is a thinking person who has a lot of different angles, utilizing other people to achieve his purpose. He probably has been thinking about this a long time.
4 bombs in 4 days, we certainly felt we had a serial bomber. And we didn't know how many other bombs were out there in the mail.
It's a quiet afternoon in the exclusive suburb of Mountain Brook, Alabama, and federal judge Robert Vance is enjoying the day with his wife of 34 years, Helen. The judge has several offices in the area, but once a month he travels to Atlanta or Montgomery, where he serves on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals.
My father was well regarded as a judge. He had a larger-than-life type personality.
Over the years, the judge's larger-than-life personality has won him more than his share of friends and admirers. So with less than 2 weeks to go till Christmas, the Vance's mailbox is literally crammed full with cards and packages.
Judge Vance apparently thinks one of them is from a friend of his, a judge on the 11th Circuit, who's sending him some horse magazines.
Judge Vance was killed almost instantly. His wife, Helen, was sitting across the table from him when the bomb went off, and she was quite seriously injured.
Mrs. Vance, amazingly, had one nail that entered her body and lodged, I believe, near her back.
Despite her injuries, Helen remains conscious and manages to dial 911. But there's a problem. The blast has left her temporarily deaf.
So she got in her van and drove to the neighbor's house, which was a couple hundred yards away, and drove up to that house and started blowing the horn. They called 911, and the ambulance came and took her to the hospital.
The victim's son, attorney Robert Vance Jr., is in New York on business when a family friend calls with the news.
He started off by saying, "Your mom's fine. She's in the hospital now." And then I asked about my dad, and he said, "He's gone." So that's how I found out about it, and it was quite a shock.
Back in Birmingham, Mountain Brook police are joined by investigators from the FBI, ATF, US Marshals, and US Postal Service. The victim's body has been removed, but the room is still peppered with flesh, blood, and shrapnel. A quaint southern kitchen transformed into a war zone.
There was semblance of bloodshed on the floor. It was very clear that there was some very serious damage done to a human being.
Here. Judge Vance had been sitting here with Miss Vance across the table. He looked at the box, and as soon as he opened it, he was blown back with all the way over to this wall.
Well, the things that came to my mind that just outraged me the most was he was killed in a brutally violent fashion. And this man's blown to smithereens in his own house right in front of his wife. There's nothing this guy could have done that warranted what just happened to him.
From hundreds of tiny fragments, explosives experts begin the painstaking task of reconstructing the killer's handiwork.
It's like putting a puzzle together. You had pieces of pipe, you had pieces of wire, you had intact nails, you had paper, you had rubber bands, you had the postage stamps that were on the package. All these things had to be collected, carefully tagged, and then they were sent to Washington to the FBI lab for examination.
My purpose is to find out what the device was and furnish that information to the field investigators to assist them in trying to determine the person or persons responsible for putting that device together and causing it to explode.
As the forensic analysis gets underway, investigators start hunting for a motive.
Your mind is going in 2 or 3 different directions. You know, was it a personal vendetta by a neighbor or a relative or a business associate? Or was it someone who didn't like his verdict in the courtroom or what he represented or his politics? All of these things come into play.
They were going through every case my dad ever decided and seeing who was involved in every case. It was a massive undertaking.
During his 12 years on the bench, Vance had ruled against Colombian drug lords, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Ku Klux Klan. And in his earlier career as the head of Alabama's Democratic Party, he'd battled against militant segregationists, earning him a number of death threats.
Well, if they would go after a federal judge like that, nobody was off limits. It was unthinkable. Now, the whole criminal justice system would break down if you murder judges. I mean, that's like something that would happen in Bogota, not Birmingham, Alabama.
It's trying to interpret the motivation for assassinating a federal judge. You're trying to determine, was this person targeted because of who he was and what he did, or what he represented to other people?
A racial motive also seems like a strong possibility. Birmingham has a violent civil rights history, from attacks on protesters to the bombing deaths of 4 little girls at the 16th Street Baptist Church.
Naturally, white supremacist type groups were among the early suspicion.
But given the specific nature of the attack, the FBI behavioral experts take the profile a step further.
A bomber chooses his weapon because he wants to make certain that somebody is going to die, but he doesn't want to be there to see it. He didn't leave the bomb in the mailbox. He let the postal authorities do it. So for him, the inference then for us was that his ego trip was beyond killing a federal judge. It was making an employee of the federal government the mailman and accessory to the crime. So we looked at that as part of his makeup, that he's the kind of person that likes to laugh at the government and feels that he can outsmart us on all levels.
But this analysis only adds to investigators' growing concerns. Was Vance simply an isolated target, or could this be just the beginning of something far more menacing?
It was a weekend, and our concern initially was what's going to happen on Monday morning. Are there others?
"24 hours after the murder of Judge Robert Vance, the man behind the bombing is still in the shadows. But an army of law enforcement agents will stop at nothing to bring him to light."
Now, I hadn't been on the job even 3 years yet, but I really wanted to be out there. I wanted to say, pick me. I want to work with you on this case.
When you kill a federal judge, then it gets the full attention of the FBI, the other federal law enforcement agencies, and it gets a lot of media attention. And there's a lot of pressure to find out who did this.
Monday, a court security officer is reviewing packages moving along a conveyor belt on the X-ray machine when he spots what appears to be the profile of a pipe bomb inside a package.
This time, the device is delivered directly to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta, the same court where Judge Vance presided.
The bomb squad there in Atlanta rendered the bomb safe and without totally destroying it. And we were able to recover almost intact a bomb.
And when the Atlanta package seems to match the one sent to the judge's home, concerns within the investigative team go through the roof.
Well, we had Judge Vance's bomb on Saturday. We had the 11th Circuit Court bomb on Monday morning. No one knew what to expect next. It was anyone's guess.
In an effort to cast a wider net, a joint task force is quickly formed between law enforcement agencies in both cities.
The FBI was the lead agency in the investigation, but we were really needing more help from other agencies, and especially expertise from the alcohol, tobacco, firearms with bombings, with the postal inspectors, with the delivery of a package in the mail, with the U.S. Marshals, who were going to be responsible for protecting all the judges.
The 11th Circuit connection is impossible to ignore, and right away, investigators intensify their search for individuals who may have had a beef with the court. But in Jacksonville, Florida, there's little reason to be suspicious of the mail coming into the local NAACP office.
Yes.
3 hours after the bomb is intercepted in Atlanta, Jacksonville chapter president Willie Dennis receives a package. But she's late for an appointment and doesn't get a chance to open it. At around the same time, a similar package arrives at the law office of Savannah NAACP attorney Robert Edward Robinson.
It's a horrific scene. The windows are blown out. His desk is blown basically in two. It is spattered with gore. The pale blue walls in his office have nails in them, and I will never forget it. I think probably the impact it had on the public was to convey, in a very important way, the horror of what this bomber has done. You know, it's one thing to see crime scene tape. It's another to see where a man's physical being has been blown away.
My son told me that his Aunt Vivian from Savannah had called and wanted to know, did I hear anything about the explosion? And I said, what explosion? She said, that's all she said. I called my mom. And when she picked up the phone, I knew something was wrong because she was screaming. And she said that it had been an explosion at Robbie's office. And she didn't know what was going on. I just more or less grabbed my purse and got in the car, me and my sons, to go there.
Barely clinging to life, Robert Robinson is rushed to the hospital where a team of 7 surgeons work desperately to save his life. But after a valiant struggle, they lose the battle. In the meantime, Robinson's sister Barbara and her sons are racing to Savannah from their home in Augusta, Georgia, 2.5 hours away.
This was very, very painful because when we were on the road, before we got to Savannah, they announced it on the radio. And that really almost caused me to have a wreck. The kids didn't know what to do because I just stopped the car and got out of the car and just started running down the highway. I don't know why, I just jumped out of the car.
The third bomb in 3 days throws the investigators for another loop. Now agents wonder, could there be a connection between the 11th Circuit Court and the NAACP? A case involving the well-known advocacy group that simply set someone off. With tensions skyrocketing, federal agencies and NAACP chapters across the country brace for the worst.
It did feel like we were under attack. You know, nobody knew when the next one was going to show up or anything. So pretty much the whole office was working this investigation.
The next morning in Jacksonville, Florida, NAACP chapter president Willie Dennis hears about the latest bombing.
Yes, I know. I'm on my way.
Something clicks. Something comes together. She calls a contact at the sheriff's office, who in turn calls a bomb technician.
After 24 very tense hours, the bomb is rendered safe. As analysts search the device for any obvious trace evidence, FBI profilers use the latest information to help get a bead on the bomber's motives.
He didn't know for certain that Mr. Robinson would open that bomb. He sent it to him at his office. In doing that, someone else could have opened his mail. He didn't care who did it. Somebody at that office was going to die. And the other two bombs that he sent to the NAACP in the 11th Circuit, those were message bombs. They were diversion bombs. And he didn't care who died there. That was an institutional diversion, not a personal assault. It's told us that this is not a run-of-the-mill, somebody is just sending a bomb out. This is a thinking person who has a lot of different angles. His thought process is involving embarrassing or utilizing other people to achieve his purpose. He probably has been thinking about this a long time and fantasizing it and planning it, and he's done research, and his fruits of his labor he couldn't wait to see on the 11 o'clock news.
4 bombs in 4 days, we certainly felt we had a serial bomber. And we didn't know how many other bombs were out there in the mail.
The Hazardous Devices School, or HDS, is an FBI U.S. Army facility located in Huntsville, Alabama. More than 2,000 bomb technicians are trained and certified there. It is the only institution of its kind in the United States. The week before Christmas, 1989, law enforcement agencies across the Southeast are on high alert after 4 bombs are delivered to unsuspecting recipients in as many days. A federal judge and a civil rights attorney are already dead, and so far, federal agents are no closer to solving the case.
Naturally, when you have 2 bombs going to the courts or to a judge, and then 2 bombs going to an NAACP lawyer in the NAACP office in Jacksonville, the conjecture was this is a hate crime. This is someone who's mad at the courts and mad at black people, the NAACP.
We don't know what the motive is, so the field of suspects is huge. And one of the worst mistakes you can make in a big investigation is narrowing the focus too soon.
The task force quickly sets up a hotline and begins fielding hundreds of calls.
There were calls from psychics who wanted to help in the investigation. There were calls from wives who were divorced from their husbands and thought this is exactly the kind of thing he would do. There were calls coming in even from jail, from people who said, hey, my cellmate last year said that when he got out, he was going to kill a federal judge. Just a wide variety of calls and information, and it was really, we were drowning in information.
And with each passing hour, the pressure only intensifies. Until law enforcement can close in on a culprit, no one is safe.
We couldn't save the judge. We couldn't save Mr. Robinson. Their fate rested with a higher authority. But there were other potential victims out there, and we knew that. And we had to do all that we could to try to stop this person from killing again.
In the lab, technicians scrutinize every component of the recovered devices. In each, the bomber was careful to paint the inside of the package black to obscure any fingerprints.
I'd never seen a device specifically like this before. All 4 devices were essentially identical to each other. The bomb that killed Judge Vance was more of what I call a traditional pipe bomb, where it had end caps that were screwed on. The other 3 devices were lengths of pipe with end plates that were welded on. That made me feel very, very comfortable to say, hey, this was built not by persons, plural, but by a singular person.
A threaded rod had been run through the end plates on the end of these pipe bombs, apparently just to delay by, I guess, milliseconds, the instant of explosion, because the more that explosion is delayed, the more force that builds up. Very risky for the bomber, because, you know, friction from turning that threaded rod with the powder inside, the welding that he did to affix the pipe together, could have had disastrous consequences for him.
The bomb's design can also provide investigators with valuable clues into what makes the bomber himself tick.
The bomb maker was a very detail-oriented person who would take a lot of time and effort to make the bombs, who would probably test different components of the bombs before he actually put them into use, and who had the money and resources to accomplish all this.
It would be a lone white male, age 45 to 53. We were extremely impressed with his overall patience demonstrated in preparing the bombs that would indicate that he would be at least middle-aged. He would be capable of being a college student. If not, he was self-taught, obviously well-read, even if he hadn't attended college. He's probably obsessive-compulsive, very neat.
But as meticulous as this bomber may seem to be, he didn't cover his tracks completely. Investigators soon discover an odd defect in the bomb's mailing labels. The number 1 has an unusual flag-shaped mark at the top.
We decided to go through the records in Atlanta of people who Judge Vance had been on the panel to hear the appeal, and see if there was anyone in that group that might be a likely suspect, especially someone that had an unfavorable ruling.
With the clock ticking, Bureau agents pour over thousands of pages of documents looking for a telltale number 1.
Everybody was on pins and needles, especially the judges.
And rightfully so. Judge Lanier Anderson in Macon, Georgia, gets an ominous letter filled with anti-government threats from a fictitious group called Americans for a Competent Federal Judicial System. Now, investigators are beginning to suspect that the bomber isn't as interested in race relations as he is in outsmarting the feds.
In other words, there's a chess game going on here. The public and the investigators are on one side of the board, and our bomber's on the other side, and that board is made up of the media. And he's making his move, we're making our move. So if we say something which he's going to perceive to be challenging, more bombs are going to fly. And that's why we carefully orchestrated press releases from then on, because we knew he would relate to what we were saying, and it may cause him to send more bombs, and we did not want to see that.
As the profilers continue to work every angle, FBI agents' efforts in the field finally pay off when the task force makes a pivotal discovery.
There's a typewriter match made between one of the threat letters and a pro se document, a court filing done without a lawyer at the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, where Judge Vance sat and where one of the bombs had been sent.
Just weeks after the bombings that kill a federal judge and a civil rights attorney, the FBI, believing a manual typewriter holds the key to the mystery, closes in on an Alabama junk dealer named Robert Wayne O'Farrell.
It was determined that the typewriter that was used on the address labels and some of the threat letters had in fact been in O'Farrell's possession.
Adding to investigators' suspicions is the discovery that O'Farrell has a well-documented beef with the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Just 2 years earlier, he'd failed in an attempt to collect benefits from his former job at an insurance company and sued for damages. Without the help of an attorney, he filed an angry appeal, only to have Judge Vance in the 11th Circuit Court throw the case out.
This certainly appeared to be a very big break in the case, to have a typewriter used by someone who had an appeal before the 11th Circuit that had been rejected only 16 months before the bombs were sent out.
With this new finding in hand, investigators waste little time ordering round-the-clock surveillance on O'Farrell.
An army of federal agents descends on Enterprise. An army of reporters descends on Enterprise, Alabama. The focus of the nation and the focus of federal law enforcement is on Enterprise, Alabama.
With snipers and medics standing by, FBI agents intercept O'Farrell at his junk shop, braced for anything. But the suspect is calm and collected.
He said he had heard about the bombing on the television, and he and his wife talked about how terrible it was. And when I told him that this was the judge that had heard his case and had turned him down in Atlanta, he said he wasn't aware of that.
Investigators soon take another tack and try to rattle O'Farrell by showing him their surveillance photos of him.
He looked at the picture and looked at another picture and looked at all the pictures. And after about 30 seconds, he looked up at me and said, "Y'all been following me?" I said, "Yes, we have." He said, "That's interesting," but didn't seem to faze him at all.
Inside the shop, agents search for components similar to those used in the construction of the bombs. They're also on the hunt for the manual typewriter. But as investigators continue their search, an unrelated and subtle detail catches their eye.
One of the first things that came to my attention was the way his shelves were put together, and I asked him who did his carpentry work, and he proudly stated that he did.
The shelves, honestly, a number of them were about ready to fall down. I can't, at that point, imagine someone building the shelves like that being the same person who had built the bombs. There was too much in the devices, too much planning had gone into the construction of those devices, and the handiwork was at a higher level that was in the bombs than what I saw in the shelves.
If the person that built these shelves tried to put the bomb together, we wouldn't be talking to him right now. He would have blown himself up.
Still, the suspect's questionable shelf-building skills aren't enough for the Bureau to let O'Farrell off the hook.
That typewriter match was viewed like a fingerprint, a match.
There was speculation that it was thrown into a lake. There was a lot of lake draggings and searching for that typewriter, but it was never located.
Picture federal agents going into Wayne O'Farrell's septic tank, and you have an idea of the thoroughness with which they scrutinized his life.
As investigators turn up the heat on O'Farrell, he opts to take a polygraph test, hoping to get them off his back. But the tactic backfires when he fails.
The polygraph coming back deceptive was very troublesome. If he had passed the polygraph, then we could sort of move on. But then there's something there that we needed to find out that he was not telling us, something he was holding back.
While agents in Alabama continue to grapple with questions surrounding O'Farrell, over 200 miles away, the ATF is already working a developing lead.
There's this monthly meeting of people who deal with bombs for a living in Metro Atlanta. Bomb techs, lab folks. It's happening at a steakhouse in Gwinnett County soon after these bombs have been discovered, same week. Somebody passes around an X-ray of the 11th Circuit bomb. A veteran ATF lab guy named Lloyd Irwin takes a look at this X-ray. and he recognizes a signature. And he says something along the lines of, I've only ever seen one bomber use that signature. Lloyd Irwin took a retirement announcement, flipped it over, drew an amazingly accurate sketch on the spot of that early 70s bomb. To a layperson, it's a much different bomb. Less powerful, different materials. But to a bomb guy like Irwin, there's a signature.
If you fish a lot and you catch one strange fish you've never seen before, and maybe you go 20 years before you ever catch another. Oh, I remember that. I caught one like that 20 years ago. So it's easy.
And the name of the fish was Walter Leroy Moody.
Moody went from one of the 20 names that a chemist remembers from 20 years ago that's got to stay on the list. Moody, at least with ATF, and with me and the case agent, Moody went high on the hit parade. We were in an agreement with the FBI that they would continue to pursue other avenues and persons of interest, but we were locking on Moody. And that was fine because, you know, it ain't over till it's over.
Delving into Moody's records, federal agents learned that back in 1971, he'd had a car repossessed. Outraged, Moody constructed a special delivery for the car dealer, whom he blamed for the ordeal. But Moody's first wife accidentally got in the way of his plans.
She had found it and proceeded to open it. And when she opened it, it blew up and injured her pretty badly.
Lucky she wasn't killed, she was maimed.
Ultimately, Moody was convicted of possessing a pipe bomb and served 3 years in prison. But his subsequent appeal to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals was rejected.
What were the odds that this guy built a package bomb previously in Macon, Georgia, and had a beef with the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals? You know, as far as I'm concerned, he's the guy.
Nevertheless, there's little evidence to suggest Moody had ever been involved in any racist activity. So why target the NAACP? It's a definite question mark. But once ATF examiners determined that the 1989 bombs are nearly identical to the bomb that went off in 1972, they immediately put a tail on Moody.
It and the 72 device were unique. The only two that I ever seen that used bolts with square plates. Even though there were still some differences, but they were kind of improvements made from the other one. As far as pipes, regular pipe bombs, I just never seen one that anybody went to that much trouble to put a pipe together when he could have made it in a tenth of the time, you know, by just buying the ready-made materials.
There were elements of those bombs that I never saw in my entire ATF career. The way he made them work with each other was superior in every way. You know, it was genius, it was madness.
Investigators are now more concerned than ever. If Moody is the man they're looking for, there's no telling how many devices could be out there. But with little in the way of solid evidence, the team finds itself at another standstill.
If this guy is the bomber, we want to make sure he doesn't send other bombs. And so we wanted to make sure he wasn't dropping packages off at post offices.
After a number of false leads and a series of deadly bombings, federal agents from the FBI and ATF focus in on a con artist from the Atlanta area named Walter Leroy Moody.
With the ATF expertise and bringing in the FBI experts to look at their case, we all came to the same conclusion that Mr. O'Farrell may or may not be involved in this case, but Mr. Moody was definitely our #1 suspect.
Moody's behavior also seems a perfect match to the FBI profile.
He had his day choreographed. He got up at the same time. He went out at the same time. He ate at the same Waffle House every morning. He went to the same place every day. He was just very rigid.
I followed him to a hotel off I-75 between Atlanta and Macon, and he went to a payphone. He called an attorney and told the attorney, I'm being followed by the feds. And I think it's because they think I killed that federal judge and sent that bomb in the mail. How in the hell does this guy know he's being followed and it's feds, and it has anything to do with the judge being killed by a mail bomb?
As the circumstantial evidence mounts against him, agents obtain a search warrant and raid Moody's home.
Moody's reaction was cool. He didn't want to talk. He wanted to talk to his lawyer, but he was confident that there would be nothing found in his house to connect him to the bombing, and he was right.
Most bomb makers leave behind some microscopic traces of their crimes, but when investigators inspect Moody's workroom, it's bare and immaculate.
Everything was clean and neat. Everything had its place and a place for everything. It had been freshly painted. There was new carpet on the floor. And in fact, the flooring, the plywood flooring had been cut out, removed and replaced. And so what they found was a sterile room in Moody's house. It was very frustrating to not find the evidence we were expecting. But on the other hand, this is what convinced me that we had the right guy.
Bombers are very meticulous people. If they're not, they kill themselves. In their persona to other people, they sometimes come across as almost effeminate, not in a homosexual way necessarily, but because they are just so neat about their hair, their dress, more like women than men. And that reflects in their bomb making, that reflects in their lifestyle. So Mr. Moody, if you looked at his appearance, it was impeccable most of the time, never a hair out of place.
But without any hard evidence, it will be impossible to make a case, especially with O'Farrell still number 2 on the suspect list.
If we bring Moody to trial, part of his defense is, I didn't do it. I didn't even have the typewriter. You never found the typewriter in my house. You never found anything else that I typed on that typewriter. It must be the junk dealer in Alabama. But finally a break came. There was information developed that the junk dealer's wife may have sold the manual typewriter to Walter Leroy Moody's wife, Susan, some months prior to the bombing.
It seems like an impossible coincidence. 2 former defendants, both with beefs against the 11th Circuit Court, inadvertently connected through an old manual typewriter. But in a lineup, O'Farrell's wife is able to identify Susan as the person who she believes bought one of their used machines. And under subsequent FBI questioning, Moody's wife cracks, admitting that she also bought a number of the items used to make the bombs.
Susan Moody had been the person Roy Moody sent out to gather the components from around the Southeast. Susan Moody was able to take investigators to the places where these components had come from. She was able to help them piece together this mosaic.
Susan Moody worshipped Moody and did his bidding. Whatever it was, she would follow and do whatever he told her. She didn't seem to have a mind of her own anymore, you know? She was his robot.
With Susan Moody's information in hand, the feds concede that Robert Wayne O'Farrell had absolutely no involvement in the bombings or the threat letters, and officially dismiss him as a suspect.
We had an outstanding investigative team that made things terribly uncomfortable for Mr. O'Farrell, but proved that he was innocent. And that's difficult for him to accept, but I hope someday that he sees that we were just doing our job, and will understand it.
A short time later, Walter Leroy Moody is indicted for the murders of Judge Robert Vance in Birmingham and attorney Robert Robinson in Savannah.
It was a good feeling that he's off the street.
Investigators theorize that Moody sent the Atlanta, Savannah, and Florida bombs as diversions meant to throw authorities off his trail. But the case is still far from ironclad. Moody has no history of racist activity, and questions remain concerning a motive in the NAACP bombings. To keep him off the street, the FBI comes up with a plan to see if their suspect will actually succeed in incriminating himself.
The investigators shared with us that he was known to talk to himself. And we were asked, is it possible that someone like him might confess something to himself? In this situation, I strongly urged that if they could get Title III approval to bug his cell, that it may well work in our benefit. And it did. And we were able to capture some information that he said that was incriminating.
In the recordings, Moody admits to killing 2 people, but justifies his actions.
Bombers, they are convinced that they are brighter than we are. They're brighter than victims, they're brighter than the system, they think things out, they fantasize about them, and bombers will rationalize that. It's not my fault he opened that package. You know, I didn't give them to him, the mailman did. It's the mailman's fault.
This guy was a revenge nut. He wanted to go to law school. He fancied himself the smartest man on the planet. And he could probably go to a law school, but he could never be admitted to the bar because of his 1972 conviction for the bomb in Macon, Georgia. So 18, 19 years later, he is still consumed with proving he didn't do that and having his conviction overturned. And he's getting nowhere.
Now Moody is facing another possible conviction, and this time, the charge is murder. The trial kicks off in June 1991, but given the unusually high degree of publicity, the venue is changed to St. Paul, Minnesota.
I saw Walter Moody for the first time in his trial, and he never showed any emotion. I remember he had a writing pad in front of him, and he would just spend his time writing on his pad. He would just sit there without any sign of remorse, just that fact alone, that he could not show any emotion under such circumstances was very telling to me.
Walter Moody killed more than my brother. I looked at him and I said, this man has just ruined our whole family. And I wanted to choke him for my brother and for my mother, for his children, and for all the grandchildren he wouldn't be able to see.
On June 28th, after 3 weeks of testimony and 13 hours of deliberation, the jury finds Walter Leroy Moody guilty of 71 federal charges. He receives 7 life sentences.
I came away from the trial convinced that Walter Moody was a very bright man, but a complete psychopath, without any regard for any other person. He was interested only in himself. And if he had some sort of grievance or grudge, then he would do what it takes to address that, without regard to how it might affect other people.
Investigators now believe that the NAACP bomb targets were innocent victims who Moody simply used in a twisted plan to exact revenge on the 11th Circuit Court.
Vance is apparently the only person he was settling a score with. And it all had to do with his obsession with lying his way out of his 1972 conviction for being a bomber.
5 years later, Moody is tried in Alabama State Court for the murder of Judge Robert Vance and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row at the Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama.
I think Lloyd Irwin really cracked the case, that his memory of what had happened back in 1972 was the key in focusing the investigation where it should be, on Walter Leroy Moody.
Moody will never be free to walk on this earth outside a U.S. penitentiary from that conviction to the day he died. I believe that Walter Moody is one of the most dangerous people that I ever encountered. He is locked up and it's over.
She opened the door to receive some flowers. Then before she could even take them in her hand, she was shot and killed.
You know, normal people are puzzled over how someone else who acts and looks normal could be so vicious, could commit such an evil, immoral act.
He would call me, tell me that he's gonna kill me.
The individual behind it is a cold, calculating killer.
It was my responsibility to find out what had happened to that person, who did it, and bring him to justice.
It's a cool January morning in the exclusive Buckhead district of Atlanta, Georgia. Often described as the jewel of the city, this quiet community will soon learn that a single act of violence can shatter their peaceful lives and set in motion one of the most torturous investigations the city has ever seen.
The lady received a call, a man not seen before in the neighborhood. Somebody wanted to get her the door to shoot her, to do harm to her.
At 8:20 in the morning, Atlanta police receive a frantic call from Buckhead resident Bob Christensen. His neighbor, a well-known socialite named Lita Sullivan, has been shot in the head. First responders quickly descend on the scene, followed by the homicide unit. The victim, barely hanging on to life, is rushed to the nearest hospital. She's alive, but unable to speak. It's now up to investigators to tell her story.
When you're working a homicide, you're listening and watching at the same time. And I'm surveying the crime scene, and I can see for myself what had transpired. There were shell casings lying on the floor, one just inside the front door and one behind the front door. It's obvious that the person who came to the door and delivered the flowers shot her. She had a chance to retreat into her house because she got about maybe 12 or 15 feet back into her house before she was hit. Matter of fact, it looks like, from my experience, like she might have been trying to get back up the steps, but she was unable to do so.
Lying on the floor is a grisly valentine, a box of long-stemmed pink roses.
Obviously, there were bullet holes on the inside. We looked for shell casings. We looked for additional fingerprints. We looked for any bits and pieces of evidence that might help us to solve the crime.
Stranger still is an item found just a few feet away. It's a postcard from a friend of the family named Ed Wheeler, and the card reads that he will not be able to testify at Lita's upcoming divorce hearing.
I didn't know whether the postcard was related to the incident or not. I didn't know. When you hear that somebody has a court hearing that same day and something like this happened, and you begin to think, what if? So that's where we were.
Then, inside one of the upstairs closets, investigators make their most startling discovery yet.
One of Lita Sullivan's best friends, Poppy Marable, was actually in the condominium.
Mrs. Marable was there with Mrs. Sullivan and spent the night with her.
Visibly shaken, Poppy explains to police that she and Lita had both been on the second floor when the flower delivery man arrived. But Lita went downstairs by herself to sign for them.
She heard the noise from the shot. She immediately locked herself in the room, and she sort of panicked. She didn't know what had taken place. It was not unusual, in my opinion, for her to kind of just stay put until help arrived.
She claims to have no idea who the assailant was since she never saw his face. But while Poppy is helpful, at this stage, police can't rule anything out.
I don't know what we have. I know we have, while at the scene, I found out that she had expired at the hospital. Then I knew we had a homicide. And it was my responsibility to find out what had happened, who did it, and bring them to justice.
Next, investigators bring Lita's neighbor, Bob Christensen, in for questioning, since he was the one who called police in the first place. Still reeling from his neighbor's death, he reconstructs the series of events leading up to the 911 call.
Well, Mr. Christensen saw a man who was strange to the neighborhood, but he had an eerie feeling about the man. The man did not have a pleasant countenance about him. And he stared at him, and stared at him to the point where it frightened him.
Unnerved, Christensen decides to mind his own business. But just moments later, he gets the shock of his life.
He heard the shot. He saw the man exit, and he went to Lita's door, and that's when he found Mrs. Sullivan lying in the floor, wounded.
Christensen gives authorities their first big break in the case, a detailed description of the assassin. But investigators know it's too early to point the finger at any one person, yet.
Everybody at that point is a person of interest. I can't eliminate anybody because I don't know anything about anybody.
In January of 1987, Atlanta police are investigating the brutal murder of socialite Lita Sullivan, who was gunned down in her home after accepting flowers from a delivery man.
We were pretty convinced that when the crime occurred, it occurred very quickly. So I doubt very seriously if there was enough time for anybody to go in to commit a robbery.
But with just a composite sketch of the shooter to go on, authorities continue to question Lita's friends for any information on who might have wanted her dead.
Most homicides are not solved by DNA, bloody fingerprints, computer records, cell phone records. Most homicides that are solved because people talk. People who know about the crime talk about it.
Lita's best friend, Poppy Marable, informs police that Lita and her husband Jim were in the middle of a messy divorce after a turbulent 11-year marriage. She goes on to say that she wouldn't be surprised if he had something to do with the murder.
Whenever you have a woman who's murdered and she's been going through a nasty divorce, right away the husband would pop up.
Detectives soon trace Jim Sullivan to Palm Beach, Florida, where he's been living since he and Lita split up 2 years earlier.
He indicated he was home alone that morning and actually took a couple of phone calls.
According to her estranged husband, Lita had been doing a lot of partying and had dated several men since their separation. He suggests that any one of them could have something to do with her murder.
When you have multiple friends and partners, that elevates the risk. And so the circles you travel in, your lifestyle, your habits, your routine, all contribute to a much higher risk and level of vulnerability and potential many more suspects. And we had to explore all of these.
Ms. Sullivan was the type of person that she knew a lot of people, her parents knew a lot of people, so she socialized.
But despite his denials, it isn't long before Sullivan realizes that he's at the top of the suspect list.
We looked at the case as a hit, a murder for hire. We felt strongly that Sullivan had the motive.
Eventually, Sullivan volunteers to take a polygraph test, and he passes.
You can't force someone to take a polygraph test. So people agree to it because they're telling the truth, and they want the police to know that and get the suspicion off themselves.
Many times in a homicide, you pursue hundreds of leads that are determined to be unfounded or not correct, and that's got to be done in order to satisfactorily identify the real suspect.
But in the process of eliminating Jim Sullivan as a suspect, they learn that he's been seeing a young woman in Palm Beach named Suki Rogers.
She became a person of interest because we were trying to eliminate everybody as a suspect. Suki was the girlfriend and Sullivan was still married. So obviously she would become a suspect because she could have a motive for wanting Lita out of the way.
Rogers gives police an alibi, but not much else. Meanwhile, Ed Wheeler, the man who sent Lita the postcard found at the crime scene, is brought in for questioning. He tells police that Lita and Jim both wanted him to testify in their divorce proceedings. Feeling trapped, he decided not to testify for either, but he didn't have the heart to tell Lita in person, so he sent the card. The story seems plausible enough, but it doesn't let Wheeler off the hook, and he remains a person of interest in the case.
Until we know what we got, like you can't just say, well, this person is eliminated. You can't do that. So you just go in with an open mind, but you go in with an open mind and you're cautious.
Investigators' next move is to focus on the roses that the shooter delivered to the house.
We knew that flowers were involved in the homicide, so we reached out and paid a visit to all of the local florist shops. And that sort of panned out for us because we actually came up with an individual in one of the flower shops.
What kind of flowers? And Randall Benson was in charge of the flower shop. He was able to give us a description of the people who came in and purchased some flowers.
Benson tells police that around 8 a.m. on the day of the murder, two men were anxiously waiting for the flower shop to open. One stayed behind in the car, while the other followed him into the store.
Benson said that this guy looked like he was kind of weather beaten, kind of worn. Randall was in the process of wrapping up the flowers, and he said the guy was in a hurry. He said, listen, stop, just let me have them. He said, well, what about the card? He said, I don't want a card. And I think he might have used a curse word to decline the card.
He threw a $20 bill at him and left without accepting the change.
15 minutes later, Lita lay bleeding on her foyer floor with those same roses by her side.
Randall Benson was brought down to the homicide unit where he was able to work with an artist to give us a composite drawing of the suspect.
Randall also provides a description of the man who stayed behind in the car. And while neither sketch matches the composite supplied by Lita's neighbor, it's still a big break for police.
Now, whether he was the shooter or not, I don't know. But it gives rise to the opinion that he was involved in some way.
Hoping that someone can identify one of the mystery men, the sketches are published in a local newspaper. And it's not long before they prompt a hot tip from an anonymous caller. The caller is not named, and therefore it's unknown whether he or she is a convict.
In any investigation, we get information and investigative leads from many different types of people.
The caller tells police that one of the composites looks a lot like a guy he used to know, who's got a reputation for shooting people. But investigators' interest is piqued when they learn where the man in question lives, Macon, Georgia, the same town Lita and Jim called home for 6 years.
The investigation was an open book, and everybody was a suspect, and every lead could have possibly been the lead that we needed. So we followed each one of them as they came in to put together a puzzle of what transpired.
The FBI Laboratory's Special Project Unit, or SPU, is staffed with a team of art specialists that not only create composite sketches, but also crime scene reconstructions, animated and interactive 2D and 3D digital models, diagrams, maps, charts, and other visual aids to help solve cases. Less than 4 weeks after Lita Sullivan is shot dead in her own doorway, police have a lead. An anonymous caller has identified a known hitman who also happens to live in Lita's old hometown of Macon, Georgia.
So we went there to try to locate the person, to try to get pictures, to try to do a sort of a background investigation on that person. We found out that he had actually died while he was in jail. Make a long story short, that turned out to be a dead end.
It's another blow to the investigation, and once again, police find themselves back at square one.
Homicide investigations are long, tedious, and sometimes they can be frustrating, particularly when you reach the point where you run out of leads. The good thing about homicide investigations is that they're never closed, and there's always the possibility that one day you'll get that bit of information that you need to solve the case.
But just as the case appears to have gone completely cold, police receive another promising tip.
In about 1991, Johnny Austin Turner, a career criminal, came forward with information that Clinton Botts and a Thomas Bruce Henley were involved in the Lita Sullivan homicide. We deemed it to be credible, and we certainly pursued it with a vengeance because no one at the time was in custody. Turner indicated that Henley had bragged about this and that he had also seen Henley in possession of a 9mm Smith & Wesson, which was determined to be the murder weapon.
A background check reveals that both Henley and Botts have criminal records. Botts had been incarcerated for burglary, while Henley served time for burglary and aggravated assault.
We were looking for the flower purchases, and Henley did have a similarity to one of the composites. They were unemployed career criminals and clearly good suspects in this case.
Police locate the two men and bring them in for questioning, but they deny any involvement. And when police interrogate their informant, Johnny Turner, again, he implicates a third man. His name is Marvin Marable.
I don't know Turner's motive other than I can't see into his head, but I do think it was to receive consideration with his sentence. He was incarcerated and possibly lighten the load on him and how much time he would have to serve if this is deemed to be plausible and good information.
Although leery of Turner's motivation, police look up Marvin Marable. To their surprise, he turns out to be the ex-husband of Lita's best friend, Poppy, and an ex-cop.
Marvin Marable was a smart man, very articulate man, quiet, a person who would exercise his Fifth Amendment rights, just refused to cooperate, other than the fact that he would give you his name and he would acknowledge the fact that he knew Mrs. Sullivan, but that was about it.
His evasiveness prompts investigators to dig a little deeper.
We had reason to believe, because of information that we had developed, that Marvin might have been a little bit jealous of the relationship between Lita and Poppy. Poppy and Lita were spending a tremendous amount of time together, and Marvin had some problems as a result of that with his wife, and that they were possibly about to end up going through divorce proceedings themselves.
That's when Marvin Marable makes a decision that will come back to haunt him.
Marvin recorded some telephone conversations that took place between Lita Sullivan and Poppy. And some of those conversations were pertaining to the divorce.
The tapes include details concerning the divorce Lita Sullivan was seeking from her husband. For a price, the ex-cop eventually shares those tapes with Jim Sullivan. But when Poppy learns about them, she tells Lita, who in turn informs the police. And Marable is ultimately charged with invasion of privacy.
How much did you get for those tapes when you sold them to someone?
Marvin was considered a suspect. He had a motive to see Lita harmed. So we was actively looking at Marvin to try to determine what his role would have been.
According to Johnny Turner, Marvin Marable was working directly with Thomas Bruce Henley and Clinton Botts. But that association soon unravels as both ex-cons are cleared of any participation.
All of that information was checked. They were interviewed, interrogated, they were polygraphed, we did search warrants, and we used every investigative technique available to us.
With no evidence that Marable was involved either, police find themselves at another standstill. But the ex-cop remains a person of interest.
When we're looking at Marvin as playing some role in the homicide, we're not sure at this point specifically what that role was.
Meanwhile, Emery and Joanne McClinton, Lita Sullivan's parents, have their own suspicions. From the beginning, they've been convinced that their son-in-law is somehow to blame. And they paint an unflattering picture of Lita and Jim's stormy relationship.
James Sullivan was a self-made, millionaire, entrepreneur who liked jewelry and fancy cars. And in 1977, married Lita McClinton, a young woman from a very prominent black family.
A few years later, Sullivan decides the couple should leave Georgia for a more glamorous lifestyle.
He takes Lita to Palm Beach, which is very much old money, very connected people, and he arrives on the scene with a black female younger than he, which is not accepted in that community.
But by 1985, it has become clear that Lita will never fit into Jim's new social circle in Florida, so she moves back to Atlanta.
He continues his lifestyle down there, fancy-free, making the connections and traveling within the circle of friends that he had established without her.
Married, but living separate lives, Lita Sullivan eventually decides to file for divorce from her husband of 11 years.
Sullivan, at the time of the homicide, was in serious financial straits. The victim was an impediment to Sullivan's financial well-being.
Lita was looking toward at least one half of all of his assets in the divorce proceeding.
In December 1991, 4 years after their beloved daughter's murder, the McClintons file a wrongful death suit against Jim Sullivan.
It's a civil proceeding in which, if found guilty, the jury awards a certain amount of money in damages.
They hope to sway the jury with startling revelations made by Sullivan's now estranged third wife, Suki.
She was afraid for her life. Jim had told her the same thing that happened to Lita could happen to her, which directly inferred that he was responsible for what happened to Lita. Suki felt that Jim Sullivan would take her life if the circumstances warranted it.
Disclosures in the civil suit against Jim Sullivan move him back to the top of the suspect list. And federal prosecutors launch a criminal case as well.
The federal government decided to move on that with minimal evidence, and as a result, they wanted to conduct a search warrant of his residence in Palm Beach.
Atlanta investigators team up with the FBI to search Sullivan's home.
We didn't discover anything that directly linked him to the homicide of Lita Sullivan.
But his phone records may tell a different story.
So we started looking at them for that particular date, the date of the homicide. And on that log of telephone calls, we saw one that was made from the Atlanta area in the 404 area to Palm Beach. And what struck me strange about it was the fact that it was during the time that we anticipated that the murder took place. And I just had the gut feeling, and I said, this right here is the key to this murder.
In 1991, Atlanta investigators looking into the murder of Lita Sullivan uncover evidence of a strange telephone call made to Lita's husband, Jim, shortly after she was killed. They are hopeful it will serve as compelling evidence in the civil and federal trials against him. And when authorities track down the source of the call, it only deepens their suspicions.
Some anonymous person picked up, and the person replied and said, no, man, this is a rest stop. It's up 85 outside of Swanee, outside the Falcons training camp.
The phone records put the time of the call at exactly 45 minutes after the shooting. So as a next step, investigators map out the route between Lita Sullivan's condo and the rest stop where the call took place.
We had a stopwatch. We left the house on Slayton Drive, and we proceeded down to the expressway. And our plan was to ride on the expressway, watching the stopwatch until the necessary amount of time went by. And once it did, we would look at where we were.
3/4 of an hour later,
we were at a rest stop off the expressway. We went to the first payphone, and to my surprise, it actually matched the number that was on the phone records that we had obtained from Jim Sullivan's.
police theorized that the shooter used the payphone at the rest stop to let Jim Sullivan know that the deed was done.
Merry Christmas.
The telephone call was quite short. We're talking about less than a minute. Perhaps just long enough to call and say, it's done, we've left.
Though compelling, the dots connecting Sullivan to Lita's murder are sketchy at best. And Jim Sullivan remains unruffled when confronted with the information. He has no trouble discrediting it, pointing out that he has many friends in Atlanta and that the call could have come from any of them. He also uses the results of his polygraph in his defense.
When people lie, the stress of lying shows itself physiologically in their cardiovascular system, heartbeat, pulse rate, and the breathing patterns, and other involuntary physiological indicators. So the polygraph is based on the idea that it is stressful to lie, and the instrument picks up evidence of that stress.
Jim Sullivan's polygraph showed no signs of stress, suggesting he had no involvement in his wife's murder. Citing lack of evidence, the judge throws out the entire federal case.
But what you're lacking is that missing middle link, the shooter, if you will. And though you know this, you can't successfully prosecute.
In Florida, however, the civil case does not go as well for Jim Sullivan. In February 1994, the jury finds Sullivan culpable in the wrongful death of his wife. They award Lita's family $4 million in damages, but before they see a penny of it, they are told the statute of limitations has run out. The Florida Supreme Court lets Sullivan off the hook.
I feel as though at that point we're closer to a solution, but we're not quite there. We're still without the flower purchasers and the shooter.
But just as the investigation appears to have stalled out for good, authorities get a hot tip that threatens to blow the case wide open. A lawyer in Houston has a client who claims to have credible information about the Sullivan murder, 35-year-old Belinda Trahan.
She began to tell me what had taken place several years earlier when she dated and lived with a man named Tony Harwood. But what Belinda told me specifically was that she felt threatened by Harwood because he had been involved in a murder for hire.
When investigators fly to Texas to check it out, they hear a story of love gone terribly sour.
Belinda Trahan met Tony Harwood in Texas when she was living out there years ago. She left Texas to live with him in Albemarle, North Carolina. He was a long-distance truck driver, and she would go with him on his trips.
We were running from state to state, moving people, hardly ever at home, living out of a truck.
Then, in November of 1986, Harwood gets a job moving a wealthy man from Georgia to Florida. But tired of life on the road, Belinda refuses to go along.
Well, when he came back, he was acting strange. And I asked him, I said, "What's with you?" And he says, "The least you know, the better off you are."
Harwood eventually confesses to Belinda that the man he just moved to Florida has hired him to kill his wife.
And I just didn't believe that. I didn't believe it at all.
But when Harwood returns home from his next trip, he assures Belinda that the deed is done.
Belinda laughed, and he said, "No, I'm serious. If you don't believe me, come with me. I'll take you to meet the man, and you can be present when he pays me."
He told me, "Come on, I want to take you somewhere."
In January 1987, a skeptical Belinda Trahan travels to a Florida diner with her boyfriend, Tony Harwood. He insists he's there to get paid for killing a rich man's wife, but Belinda isn't buying it.
In comes this guy, a tall, lanky guy, and he just didn't look like he belonged there. He looked like he belonged, on a yacht. And he looks over at Harwood and he says, "What is she doing here?" And Harwood says, "It's okay."
Then the man pushes a folded newspaper across the table to Harwood.
And there's a large envelope in there, and it's got money in it. He just fanned it. And then I thought, oh my God. Oh my God. Now I'm in fear for my life.
Terrified, Belinda leaves Harwood and flees back to her hometown in Texas.
He would call me, tell me that he's gonna kill me. He's gonna kill me. He's gonna do this and that. He has always, always threatened me, called me constantly since 1987. I was afraid.
Investigators then ask Belinda if she can identify the man who paid Harwood that night at the diner.
When I pointed him out, they asked me how sure I was of it, and I said, I'm 99% sure that's him.
Belinda identifies Jim Sullivan, Lita's estranged husband, as the mastermind behind her cold-blooded murder.
I was the only one that could link the face of Sullivan to Harwood.
Investigators waste no time devising a trap to snare Harwood. But in order for it to work, Belinda will have to serve as bait.
That was the only way that we could get Harwood to admit to where he was at. My feelings towards it was something I need to do, I want to do.
My instructions to her was just have a normal conversation and to kind of go back over the murder. Tony Harwood began coaching Belinda on what to say to law enforcement. So, you know, to have his voice on there talking about the murder was overwhelming evidence.
But investigators aren't satisfied just yet. They still need to establish a hard link between Harwood and the Sullivans.
And I went to the moving company that Tony had worked at, and I found the contract where Jim Sullivan and Tony Harwood both signed off on the moving agreement.
The contract, along with the tape recordings, is enough to secure an arrest warrant for Tony Harwood.
We took Harwood into custody, and the first thing that he said when we picked him up was, "I've been waiting for you guys for a long time." So after that, everything just fell into place. We were convinced that we had the right person.
Authorities' next step is to convince Harwood to cooperate. They believe they have their shooter, but it's the mastermind they really want.
The mastermind mistakenly believes that if they get someone else to commit the murder, they're going to be home free because they have an alibi.
Tony Harwood told us that he met Jim Sullivan when he picked up a load of furniture from Macon, Georgia, and transported it to Palm Beach to Jim Sullivan's mansion. He and Sullivan had a conversation regarding having Sullivan's wife bumped off.
But he remains evasive about his own role in the murder.
Harwood claimed, and no one believed him, that he was just a getaway driver. He was just the real trigger man's accomplice. But in my opinion, Harwood was the assassin.
Tony Harwood indicated that there was other people involved. However, he said that he did not know who they were, none of which we believed. We believed that Tony Harwood acted in concert with others that he did know.
But investigators have no evidence as to who those accomplices might be. They also concede that neither Ed Wheeler nor Marvin Marable had any involvement in the crime and officially drop each of them as a person of interest. Harwood eventually pleads guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for agreeing to testify against Sullivan. And in April 1998, Atlanta police issue a murder warrant for his arrest.
Sullivan ran immediately. When Harwood was arrested, I have no doubt in my mind that Sullivan was notified, whether it be via an immediate account, attorney, don't know who, but he was notified and he immediately fled.
Suddenly, federal and local authorities find themselves on a worldwide manhunt.
We're never concerned about whether or not we're going to find Mr. Sullivan. We just know that it's going to be a lengthy investigation, especially somebody that has the money that Mr. Sullivan had.
With his millions of dollars, Sullivan could realistically be anywhere.
You know, if Jim Sullivan had the opportunity, that he would have any one of the witnesses killed, and people were in fear.
I went into hiding, and we actually have a crawl space in our house, and I was living up beneath the house with my 357 and just waiting for them to find out something, where he was, where'd he go. I was very scared, and I was very scared for my family.
Unfortunately, finding Sullivan is no easy task, and by 2002, all leads have gone stale. It is then that investigators decide to use the media to their advantage.
America's Most Wanted has always been a friend of law enforcement. They've always been very helpful in assisting in locating fugitives, especially fugitives that are very difficult to catch.
In the program's wake, 3 different tips come in from Thailand. When Thai authorities investigate, they discover that Sullivan had in fact entered the country in 1998 and has been living in an upscale beach community ever since. His neighbors are shocked to learn that they have a suspected murderer in their midst.
The surprising aspect of many of these murder-for-hire cases is actually the identity of the mastermind, people that you would never expect would be capable of such a cold-blooded crime. And these people could include, successful business people, politicians, lawyers, physicians.
On July 3rd, 2002, Jim Sullivan's long holiday finally comes to an end.
He was in total shock and disbelief that he had been located and continued to deny any involvement in the murder of his wife.
19 years since Lita Sullivan was shot and killed, the wheels of justice finally begin to turn when Jim Sullivan finds himself back in a U.S. courtroom. But he's still defiant, pleading not guilty and maintaining his innocence to the bitter end.
These people don't look like monsters, but there's something inside them that's broken. They have these terrible personality disorders that don't manifest itself until they commit these crimes. And then we're left wondering, how could anyone do such a thing?
The prosecution paints a portrait of a man driven by greed.
He felt that his financial well-being was more important than his wife's life. So that the only way he could get out of this was to have his wife murdered. He could see no alternative. And so he had her killed.
Sullivan decides not to testify at his own trial, but Belinda Trahan and Tony Harwood do.
Murder for hire is difficult to get away with because between the time that the mastermind meets the hitman and the time of the murder, there are all kinds of people involved. And the mastermind's fingerprints are really all over the crime, even though they're not at the scene of the crime.
In March 2006, Sullivan is found guilty of felony murder. At the age of 64, he is sentenced to life without parole.
He looked like he was just numb to everything. He didn't show much emotion of any kind.
With nearly 2 decades of investigative work behind them, FBI agents and local police can finally close the book on Jim Sullivan. But many still wonder how he was able to pass the polygraph test so many years ago.
Well, the polygraph detects the stress associated with lying. Now, a sociopath or a pathological liar who actually can either convince himself that he's telling the truth or has no stress whatsoever in lying isn't going to react.
Sullivan just felt as though he was smarter and better than everyone, and I think there's a sense of satisfaction when you pursue someone like that and ultimately try and convict them that he got exactly what he deserved.
What I can't get over in murder-for-hire cases is that otherwise intelligent and successful people would do such a thing. It's the cold-blooded, premeditated nature of this kind of homicide that's the most disturbing.